Hello YouTube, Internet, World. Welcome back to another episode of Dime Store Cinema on the road. Let's talk movies. Today I'd like to discuss the 2015 low-budget horror film, The Devil's Candy. I just watched this movie today, actually, and I gotta say, I really liked it. I'll get into specifically why in a little bit. And as always, with most of my reviews, or more discussions really, I will get into spoiler area. So if you're not interested in the movie being spoiled at all, I apologize. But I find that it's hard to discuss a film in detail without giving at least some of the ending away. I'll try not to give so much of it away that it'll ruin the viewing experience, but at the same time there are aspects of the film that all tie together at the end that I will talk about a little bit. In any case, this is the story of a painter and his family. They buy a new house. They, on the day of buying the house, find out that there were deaths in the house, 2 deaths in the house, an elderly man and an elderly woman. The story goes that the elderly woman died by falling down the stairs, and then the elderly gentleman could not handle the guilt, or not the guilt, but he could not handle life without his wife, so he killed himself. That's the official story. So, they buy the house, and after buying the house, one of the big reasons why they decide to buy the house is because it has a space that the husband and father, the main character, can turn into an art studio for his paintings. He's a artist still trying to be discovered, trying to find his voice on the canvas, as it were. So that's the reason they buy the house, despite the story. In fact, he even turns it into a romantic story about how, you know, the gentleman couldn't live without his wife, and yada, yada, yada. In any case, as soon as they buy the house, as you would expect in a horror film, strange things happen. Primarily to him, he starts losing track of time, and he's spending all of his time in his studio, completely losing himself in his artwork. Now, so far, fairly standard as far as horror films go. I want to point out, though, what makes this one a little different is that rather than the protagonist or the focal point, the artist, rather than him going insane, getting to the point where he's losing grip with himself in reality, he remains a very sympathetic character. He loses track of his time, but in his time when he's not lost in his art, he's very much himself. And he hates that he's losing track of time, and he's very apologetic for it. It causes him to forget to pick up his daughter and to generally miss out on his family life. And he hates that. He loves his family, and he portrays a loving father very well in this. You know, like I said, he remains very sympathetic. So, as it goes on, so that's one aspect that's going on, and then in the background there's a gentleman who's obviously not all there, and I mean that both psychologically and developmentally. A slow man who is also hearing voices that tell him to do things, and part of the way he copes is to play loud music, but then when that is taken away from him as well. He starts succumbing to the voices, and as you start to realize, he starts succumbing to the voices yet again, returning to a murderous compulsion. So then you have that undercurrent. So then the 2 points converge when you realize that the gentleman who is hearing voices used to live in the house that the artist and his family just purchased. And then it slowly becomes apparent that the murderer is more than likely responsible for the deaths of his parents, and also responsible for the deaths of many other children. And through the course of this, you learn that the reason he targets children is because they are, in fact, the titular characters. That the children are the devil's candy. It comes out in a point of dialogue that children are the sweetest candy. So obviously it is a very messed up individual. So this murderer focuses on the artist's daughter. And that's the plot. It's a very straightforward horror film. It's a plot that we've seen 100 times before. Nothing really spectacular about the plot or the story or even the structure of the story. What makes this movie interesting, and probably a little better than most that come out, is the attention to detail. There's not very much gore in this movie. There is some. But the way that the movie is filmed, it makes the paint from the artist look very gruesome. So the gore is the paint. That's very interesting, the way that they do that. They create this uneasy tension by the way that they film the artist painting. And the main character's performance also helps in this. He's mastered the vacant look, and just by looking at him, you know that he is being overtaken. And it's a form of astral projection, because the painting that he paints on this large canvas, essentially it's the twisted story of all or most of the children that were murdered. So it's this unwitting tapping into the spiritual realm, and these children calling him, essentially. And the whole movie culminates with him finding their bodies. Once again, without showing much gore or gruesome detail, which I kind of appreciated, because the film itself is very gritty, and you'd almost expect it to be very gruesome in its depiction of the violence, but they really do a good job of kind of holding back, and I appreciate that. A lot of low budget and independent horror films, to make up for the fact they can't do a lot, they'll just throw in a bunch of gore. And that's not always the case. You have great examples of restraint, particularly recently with films like The Babadook and It Follows and films like that. So I think that the appeal of restraint is kind of making its way back to the forefront of horror fans. They start realizing that a lot of tension is built by not seeing. And the fine line you have to tread is how much to see, because if you don't see anything, it comes off looking really cheap. But if you see too much, it just comes off gimmicky and it ruins the suspense. So there's this very fine line. Most of the time, I think it just comes down to a director being able to navigate his own story really, really well. And I don't think many people are able to do it effectively. And that's what distinguishes a good director and a not good director. You know, it's the ability to actually navigate that story. And I think that in this one, it's a short little film. It's very contained. It doesn't try to do more or less than it can. It really blurs the line between psychological and spiritual, which I really like. It leaves a lot of questions, which is great, but not questions of plot, but questions of how much of this was psychological and how much of this was supernatural, if any. You know, you're dealing with the whole concept of astral projection, but he's not pursuing that. It's something that's forced on him, which is interesting. And then the killer, it's almost a sympathetic killer, but at the same time, not, because he's so vile. But it's kind of like he is being manipulated by a much stronger force. So in that sense, it's he's very sympathetic in that he's a handicapped individual being manipulated, and that's, I mean, that's horrible, and it's a horrible thing to see. But the way he portrayed that compulsion was really good. He did a very good job of playing the unwitting assassin, as it were. You could tell that there were moments of a strong desire to not hurt, particularly the artist's daughter. They had a brief moment and they connected over a guitar. And he really didn't want to hurt her. And he even told her a way in which he wouldn't have to hurt her. He explained that if she remained quiet, he wouldn't have to hurt her. But, of course, fear took over and she screamed. And that raised the voice in him once again, and he was compelled. So I thought his performance was really good. The gentleman playing the murderer, and I can't remember his name off the top of my head. He did a really good job. But that's really what I wanted to say. And like I said, I'm gonna try not to spoil too much. I mean, the very end, as I said, it culminates with the artist finding the children that were speaking to him through his painting. So I mean, that's the very end, but that's without giving too much away as far as the road getting there. But what I loved the most about this movie, and I know I already said it, is just how contained it was. It was just a, you know, hour and 19-minute film. Really good pacing. You know, I think the way that they filmed, you know, there's a lot of him in his studio painting, but the way they filmed it, you know, that was the most violent part of the movie, really, is the way they filmed that. It made it seem very violent, which is interesting in the way that they kind of forced that perspective. And I mean, to me, that shows a very competent director and editor, someone who's able to take a mundane situation and make it very interesting and creepy. I think David Lynch is one of the masters of that. You know, taking a very mundane conversation or situation and turning it into something that is absolutely horrific. And this movie did that, and partly through how gritty it was stylistically, but then also partly through the editing and the directing of particularly the painting scenes. But it was also a mix of really beautiful wide shots, and it's interesting because within the beautiful wide shots that there's always this element that something going on in them that is the opposite of that. So there's always this underlying unease and expectation that something horrible is going to happen throughout the whole movie, and it did really good at building that suspense. My gripe with the movie is that, like with a lot of horror films, there are just a lot of really dumb decisions. People just do stupid things. And it happens so much in horror films, and it bothers me. And like, I don't think that I don't complain as much as a lot of people when, you know, people do things in movies. You know, like the people who say hello and go looking if they hear a noise. Like, a lot of people complain about that. But I mean, in all honesty, if I heard a noise in my apartment before knowing that there was someone who was going to kill me, I would probably go looking around my apartment to make sure that nothing was broken, or to make sure that there weren't like animals in my apartment, or making sure there wasn't a drunk person who wandered in on accident, which has almost happened. I mean, you know, so I would go looking if I heard a noise. Like, just because we have the perspective of, oh, there's a killer on the loose, doesn't mean that the person in the movie does. So I mean, that's not always the case. What bothers me is when characters know that there's a threat, and they even know specifically what the threat is, and they still do that. And that happens in this movie. Just like decisions that are made, like they could run and they don't, and they could, I don't know, follow through on their actions and they don't, and just like really, really dumb decisions are made throughout this entire movie. Like worse than a lot of horror films, like worse than, like I said, with horror films where actions are done out of ignorance that seem very annoying. Like, this is like actions done in full knowledge of the consequences, and just, it just bothers me. It didn't ruin the movie for me, though. I still really enjoyed this movie. I still would recommend seeing it if you're into horror films. There really wasn't that much, wasn't that much to say negative about the movie. Like I said, my only complaint was really some of the characters being dumb, but you know, that's standard in horror films. So if you can handle almost any other horror film, you can handle this one. And I'd say this one's made better than a lot, like most, I would even say, of the independent horror that comes out. So those are my 2 cents. You know, like I said, if you like horror films, I suggest watching it. I think it's a great little film, very competently made, highly enjoyable. So yeah, please please subscribe if you're interested in this kind of thing, and I'll talk to you all next time.